Hi, everyone. Excuse me. Just ate a cookie. Hi, everyone. Hope everybody's doing well. It's kind of a weird day. Been a lot of weird days lately. Just saying. All right. Chapter 24. Beam warfare. By the mid-1970s, full-scale electromagnetic warfare was in progress between the United States and the Soviet Union. Although full details of that war would not leak out until years later. On October 30th, 1976, the New York Times published a report revealing that a broadband shortwave radio signal was being broadcast from the Soviet Union that disrupted radio and other electronic communications worldwide. The radio signal, varying in frequency between about 3.26 and 17.54 megahertz, was initiated on July 4th, 1976, the date of the U.S. bicentennial, and continued to be broadcast in the years to follow. The signal came from a high-power transmitter located near Kiev in the Ukraine. Interesting. Ukraine. Due to the pulse modulation, the radio signal produced a unique woodpecker-like chatter on radio receivers, hence its informal name, the Russian woodpecker. According to electromagnetics expert Robert Beck, the signal is so strong it drowns out anything else on its wavelength. It first appeared on the UN International Telecommunications channels, including the emergency frequencies for aircraft on transoceanic flights. That's not good. Now, the woodpecker leaves holes. It skips the crucial frequencies as it moves up and down the spectrum. The signal is maintained at enormous expense from a current total of 7 nations, the 7 most powerful radio transmitters in the world. Since the first broadcasts of the Russian woodpecker, at least 30 similar transmission centers have been set up by the Russians, sending signals in the same dangerous frequency range. Shortly after the Russian woodpecker began broadcasting, complaints were heard from numerous locations in the United States and Canada, but mostly centered in Oregon, of people experiencing headaches, anxiety, lack of body coordination, and other symptoms. Dr. Andrija Puharich, who had been researching electromagnetics at the fringes of spookdom since the early 50s, commented on the Soviet signal in 1983. When the Soviets went on the air in July 4th, 1976 with their 100-megawatt transmissions of extremely low-frequency waves, ELFs, the intelligence community of the U.S. was caught unaware of this new technology. Interesting. The Soviets' ELF pulses covered the frequency range of the human brain. No one knew what the purpose of this new technology was. I had a hypothesis that this was a new mind control weapon that could entrain a human being's EEG. Bob Beck and I designed an experiment that conclusively proved that the Soviet transmissions could indeed entrain the human brain and thereby induce behavioral modification. I reported this finding to the intelligence community in the US, and my paper was promptly classified. A CIA Commission of Inquiry reported to President Carter that there was no substance to our findings. Really? And here we have today. Today, 5 years later, all of our findings have been confirmed by various agencies of the US government. However, they went one step beyond our findings and proved that a certain ELF frequency, classified, will cause cancer. I have repeated these experiments and found this to be true. A single ELF frequency can produce cancer. Elsewhere, Puharich said, the U.S. Air Force identified 5 different frequencies in this compound harmonic the Russians were sending through the Earth and the atmosphere. The intention was to effect a change of consciousness in mankind. The extremely low frequency waves will penetrate anything and everything. The specially shielded Faraday cage, the ocean. Nothing stops or weakens these signals. So they're saying that a Faraday cage doesn't work. I mean, these frequencies go right through a Faraday cage. What does that tell you? Referring to himself in the third person, he said, Dr. Puharich and Robert Beck designed receiving equipment which could measure these waves and their effect on the human brain. Their equipment proved that a signal of 6 Hertz easily penetrated the copper walls of a Faraday cage. So could a rate of 6.6. There's all the numbers, right? 666. Of the rates being used by the Russians. This caused depression. 7.83 Hertz could make a person feel good. That's the Schumann resonance, right? Or original Schumann resonance of the Earth. This is the so-called Schumann resonance, the Earth's pulse rate. 10.80 Hertz could cause riotous behavior. As far as he could determine, the Soviets never sent out a signal in the 8 Hertz range that would be beneficial to people. When Dr. Puharich presented this information to certain U.S. military leaders, they would not believe him. Excuse me. He then made up a secret report and had it hand-delivered to President Carter, to the head of the French intelligence service, to Prime Minister Trudeau of Canada. And to certain dignitaries of other Western nations. Heavy action was then taken by our government to shut him up. His home in Ossining, New York, containing the results of much of his research work, was burned to the ground. He fled for his life to Mexico. From there, he continued to monitor the Russian ELF wave signals and the higher harmonics in the megahertz range, 5.340 megahertz. Through his Washington contacts, a group meeting was arranged with the CIA. A showdown ensued, an agreement reached. Since then, no trouble with the CIA except for the publication of his books. The government program is now called the ELF, for extremely low frequency, and the Navy set up a research program on it 2 years later. Puharich's secret report was expanded into a book under contract to Dell Publishing Company, but publication has been blocked for the past 4 years. Meanwhile, the Russian attacks go on. unknown to the general public. Whole populations can be controlled by ELF waves. Whole populations can be controlled by ELF waves. Intensive research on such behavior modification is now being conducted by the United States government to find out just what such waves do to people. This electromagnetic research is similar to the secret drug experiments conducted on the unsuspecting populace in the 1950s. Dr. Puharich did identify one ELF wave as a cancer-causing agent in mice. These waves cannot be jammed. The lower frequency Hertz waves are as long as 300,000 miles. The government has built huge transmitters in South Africa, Australia, and other places to beam ELF waves back at Russia. There is no shield that will stop these signals. At a conference on electromagnetism in September of 1987, Puharich said, quote, "In 1981, the U.S. government went into full-scale ELF warfare and set up all their big transmitters down under in Australia and Africa, so on, and now Africa, so on. And now they're in business and everything's classified and you can't say a goddamn thing about it. A tough situation. And you can't get any real information out of any government agency. And I know all of them that they do the work. I know the people who head the projects, etc. When they're in trouble, they usually come and ask me. And they classify what I tell them. Insanity. Although the United States government did not officially acknowledge that the country was under electromagnetic assault from a foreign power, they apparently did respond in kind beyond what Puharich documented. Stefan Redknapp, a journalist living in England, reported that he had gotten access to secret documents about an American electromagnetics program called Operation Peak. Remember that. Pique. That involved firing electromagnetic signals off the ionosphere to ricochet down on Eastern Europe. Ionosphere. Firmament. With a particular focus being Eastern European nuclear installations. What is apparently the most recent and largest escalation in the beam war is the construction of the HARP project in the Alaskan wilderness. Okay, now HARP is all over the world, by the way, just FYI. HARP is the world's largest electromagnetic broadcasting station, composed of 180 high-frequency broadcast antennae with power estimated at 72,000 times more than the next most powerful radio transmitter. The project is the creation of the U.S. Air Force Phillips Lab, the Naval Research Laboratory, and the Office of Naval Research. Oh my God, the Navy. Although announced as a facility for ionospheric research, HARP seems to have a number of other potential uses, including weather control and electromagnetic sweeps that can be used for mind control of large populations. Of odd note is the observation of a civilian who was monitoring the output of the HARP transmissions at precisely the times that the recent mass murder in Littleton, Colorado took place. According to Kent Stedman, a peak in HAARP transmission occurred between 10:40 p.m. 10:40 p. Pacific Daylight Time and 1:20 Pacific Daylight Time. The shootings began between 11 and 11:30 Pacific Daylight Time. This is interesting. The book is called HAARP, the Beast in the Alaskan Wilderness, Wake Up Call America. Kent Stedman. That would be worth reading, but that was a long time ago, 1999. That was 20 years ago. And now look what we have. Oh, fancy that. Look, we're having riots all over the United States, specifically, a few other places in the world. But they're having more protests other places, and people aren't getting killed. That's only happening here, right now. Chapter 25, The Persinger Plan. Dr. Michael Persinger, a psychologist and neuroscientist employed at Laurentian University in Ontario, Canada, lives at the cutting edge of research into the effects of electromagnetics on the mind. Persinger, on the board of advisors of the False Memory Syndrome Foundation, has been funded by the Navy and reportedly the National Security Agency, and did research on the effects of electromagnetic radiation on the brain for a Pentagon weapons project, according to researcher Daniel Brandt. Persinger says, "My research has not been funded by U.S. interests. All of the money for our human research for the last..." Dude. All of the money for our human research for the last 30 years has been from my personal income as a professor. The only funding, $10,000, we ever obtained from the U.S. was from the U.S. Navy. Among Persinger's accomplishments is the ability to cause subjects to think that they have been abducted by aliens or have had an encounter with angels or God through the use of a modified motorcycle helmet equipped with solenoids to send electromagnetic pulses through the frontal lobes of their brains. Ultimately, Persinger says, human experience is determined by what is happening in the brain. And the experience of God can be generated by a process that has nothing to do with whether God exists or not. In 1993, British journalist Ian Cotton put on the Persinger helmet in the course of research on a book on evangelical Christianity. Persinger's team rang temple bells while Cotton's brain was being irradiated, and he said, "I was actually in a line of solemn Tibetan monks, grave-eyed brown cowls around their heads. I too was a Tibetan monk, and what I realized was that I always had been." Persinger's article on the possibility of directly accessing every human brain by electromagnetic induction of fundamental algorithms, published in Perceptual and Motor Skills in June 1995, delves into even more far-reaching mind control possibilities. Concealed within scientific jargon that may be purposefully daunting in its complexity are keys to understanding just how far mind monitoring and influence has progressed in current years. Now imagine, this was 20 years ago, people. I just have to keep saying that. The article states that contemporary neuroscience has discovered that there are fundamental algorithms and specific codes through which the brain operates. Persinger says that these codes can be stimulated through contemporary communication networks, and a process which is coupled to the narrow band of brain temperature could allow all normal human brains to be affected by a subharmonic whose frequency range at about 10 hertz would only vary by 0.1 hertz. These codes would be determined by the human genome, i.e., be species specific, and would contribute to or would serve as a substrate upon which all phenomena that affect neurobehavioral measures are superimposed. Let me read that again. These codes would be determined by the human genome, i.e., be species specific, and would contribute to or would serve as a substrate upon which all phenomena that affect neurobehavioral measures are superimposed. Persinger says that one logical extrapolation to a neurophysical basis of consciousness is that random variations of noise within the matrices could potentially differentiate between individual brains. In other words, individuals could be identified by the specific characteristics of their brain output. Identification of these sequences could also allow direct access to the most complex neurocognitive processes associated with the sense of self, human consciousness, and the aggregate of experiential representations, episodic memory, that define the individual within the brain. In other words, using the techniques that Persinger outlines, a person's memory, consciousness, and sense of self can be fully accessed and modified by electromagnetic means. In a sentiment that harkens back to the research and statements of Dr. Ewan Cameron, who employed far more primitive means of erasing consciousness. Persinger states that he has been studying application of weak electromagnetic fields whose intensities are usually less than 10 milligrams, 1 micro T. The purpose of this research is to identify the basic codes for the language of the representational systems within the human brain. Using the information thus obtained, brain processes can be circumvented by direct introduction of this information within the brain. The basic premise is that synthetic duplication of the neuroelectrical, God, this is like blah, 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 science. I can read it, but it's like my brain doesn't want to do it. The basic premise is that synthetic duplication of the neuroelectrical correlates generally. Oh my God. The basic premise is that synthetic duplication of the neuroelectrical correlates generated by sensors to an actual stimulus should produce identical experiences without the presence of that stimulus. Persinger is saying that experiences, feelings, memories, virtually any mental state can be artificially injected into a human brain from an exterior source. The most frightening thing is that the means for doing this already exist in a fully operational form on a worldwide basis. This is in the 90s, folks. Persinger says the power levels for these amplitudes are similar to those associated with the signals generated globally by radio and communication systems. Within the last 2 decades, a potential has emerged which was improbable, but which is now marginally feasible. This potential is the technical capability to influence directly the major portion of the approximately 6 billion brains of the human species. By generating neural information within a physical medium within which all members of the species are immersed. Within all the jargon, most of which I have eliminated in this paraphrase, Persinger's message is that the entire human race can be mind controlled through the use of television and radio networks. Shall I continue? I will, but not now. So as you can see, folks, we are there. 2020 is a plan that has been enacted over a long period of time and is now in full swing. There's no question in my mind about that. There's no question in anybody else's mind about that. Now the question is, are we going to allow it, or are we going to wake everyone up? It is the sole responsibility of the person to wake themselves up as sovereign human beings in a body on this planet. However, there are some people who most likely will not wake up and will continue to vibrate in the matrix consciousness. And then there will be those who wake up and will not allow for the continuation of the madness. Now, right now, it looks pretty good, actually. There are millions of people all over the world protesting the COVID hoax. Not that it hasn't killed people, because it has supposedly killed some people. But it didn't go as planned. Poor Billy Gates. He's not gonna succeed. You gotta feel sorry for the guy. Not. But it's kind of a joke at this point that we all know that that little plan of theirs failed. And it, you know, it's causing a lot of damage. It's causing a lot of, they're continuing to cause trauma. So what we're experiencing is actually trauma-based mind control. That's what we're experiencing. They are literally throwing things at us to upset us now. It's all by design. So it's whether or not we choose to be upset or go along with the mind control, or if we use our sovereign consciousness and we pay attention to what it is that we are experiencing, and we step out of that into our own original thought forms, right? Something that occurred to me that I didn't mention before in terms of electronic warfare from this book a few chapters back in the last day or so was the immobilization that happens when they pin you to the bed or they pin you to the floor and you can't move. I personally experienced that for many, many years, about 7 solid years of my life. I went through that experience from about 2007 to 2014. And for a long time, I thought it was my adrenals and that they had crashed and that I was just basically having adrenal issues. But in fact, I was not. I mean, I was. I healed my body and that helped a lot. And I did a core health rebuild program. And when I dismantled the targeting, my energy came back. So it became very clear to me that the energy loss that I had been experiencing, that I thought was chronic fatigue and Epstein-Barr virus, which in fact I had Epstein-Barr virus and I was able to back it out of my system, thank goodness. But on top of that, I mean, it was that and the target, the electronic beaming that caused me to push through walls of exhaustion just to function. And that is no longer the case. And for me to recover and come back to life so completely the way that I have, after all of the targeting and all of the health issues that I have had as a direct result of outside influences, is phenomenal. The fact that I'm here and that I'm not dead is phenomenal, right? Like, having direct hits on your life pretty much once a week, your whole life, you know, you get used to it. You kind of look over your shoulder. I don't have to do that anymore. So that's kind of a miracle in and of itself, right? Like, that I'm not needing to look over my shoulder anymore. It's kind of it absolutely is a miracle. I don't know why I'm saying it's kind of. It absolutely is a miracle that I don't live in that world anymore. So stepping out of that and understanding electronic warfare and how it works and how beams are being used on the population, and certain people are sensitive to that, certain people are completely numb to it. But I feel that the act of electronically targeting an individual, you know, there's a lot of targeted individuals in the world and they have stories, but a lot of other people are targeted individuals and they don't actually realize that they're being targeted. And now it's on a mass scale. So the entire population right now, this was their goal, to target the entire human population and see if they could create something with that targeting. And they have done that. Absolutely. They have spread fear across the entire planet to the point where people are willing to comply. And enough people are not paying attention still, to the point where people still believe that this is actually real, what's going on, when in fact they have come out now and said only 6% of the deaths in the United States that were virus deaths are actually caused by the virus. That everything else was a comorbidity or had nothing to do with it, but it was just labeled as it. That's just how they've gotten away with it, right? They just like throw it into that category and you can't trust any of the numbers. So now there's been an executive order that created the actual testing being reported per state so that they could see the real numbers, and they had to be monitored while they were doing the testing so that they wouldn't cheat and inflate the numbers. And then they had to come clean with the fact that they'd inflated all the numbers. This just happened 2 days ago, okay? The CDC admitted that they had inflated all the numbers, and only 6%, but they did it under the radar so nobody was paying attention. Well, people are paying attention. Okay? So I was just watching the 2020 top 10 auditions for America's Got Talent. It just came up on my thing. So I started watching it. And then I realized that it was 2020, right? I realized that I was watching people, 3,500 people in an audience, sitting right next to each other, no masks anywhere, like anywhere. No masks anywhere. 2020. And the only reason why I knew it was after March was because Sophia, one of the women on there, the Brazilian woman, she said, I'd give you a hug, but we're in this like pandemic thing or something like that. And so everyone was doing this, like, oh, I want to hug you, but I can't. But nobody was wearing a mask. Nobody was standing 6 feet apart. Everybody was sitting in the audience like as if there was nothing happening anywhere on the planet. How is it that the America's Got Talent situation is exempt from mask wearing and standing 6 feet apart and standing in line and not getting and sitting 6 feet apart? How is that? If it's real, come on, man. That was the biggest indication for me that this whole thing is a fucking hoax, because if it were real, they would go out of their way to have people in the audience they wouldn't even have an audience. But they were all sitting there next to each other as if nothing had ever happened. Blew my mind. I just sat and watched an hour of it. Of all the different shows from 2020, of all the different top auditions, because I wanted to see. I was like, wait a minute, this says 2020. I'm going to check this out. 3,500 people in the audience. Not one person wearing a mask. Not one person sitting away from someone else. There's no social distancing. Nada. Are you fucking kidding me right now? I'm so grateful that I have the wherewithal and the sense, the common sense, to know and have discernment on what's real and what's not. And also to have the common sense to have affected in some way the outcome of this virus that came from China, okay? I directly went to work to make sure that, the effect would be more of a global mass awakening than it would be of death and destruction. I turned that shit around. I reprogrammed it. I wasn't having it the minute I heard about it. So I know that's a lot for me to admit on camera. But at this point, this is what's important, is that people understand that this is all in the consciousness fields and the electricity and the electromagnetic fields that are circling around the earth. If we were all to collectively come together, you know what I'm saying? Like for real. For real. There's no way. There's so many more of us. And this just goes to show you that this has been going on for a really long time. They are very well organized. And they won't win. Because they're all out in the open now. There's no hiding anymore. But there's still plenty of them operating and trying to dismantle the human arena. But they will not succeed. Note. Please note, they will not succeed. There is too much cosmic light being deposited on the planet now. There's too much exposure of the dark. The veils have been lifted. There's nowhere for them to hide. They must come out in the open. Transparency is key. Right? That's what's got to happen. So I love you. I've been talking long enough. Thank you for being here. I'll see you on the next round. Bye.